On the cold sidewalks of New York, a man stood with a trembling sign in his hands, on the verge of losing his last shred of hope. The sign had bold letters scrawled across it, "I was wronged. Please help." His face was pale, his worn and dirty coat barely shielding him from the biting cold. People rushed past him, their eyes fixed ahead, refusing to acknowledge his presence. It was as if he were invisible. But that day, someone saw him. Robert De Niro, returning from his morning walk, noticed the man among the sea of indifferent faces. Despite his fame, Robert knew the cruelty of life all too well. He had witnessed injustice time and time again. But in this man's eyes, he saw something beyond desperation. He saw anger, betrayal, and a lingering fight. He stepped closer, crouched slightly to meet the man's gaze, and spoke in a calm, steady voice. "You say you've been wronged. Tell me, what happened?" The man slowly lifted his head. His eyes were damp, his voice rough with emotion, but he began to speak. And so, the cry of a man abandoned by the world finally reached someone willing to listen. The man took a deep breath, his gaze shifting downward as he whispered, "I worked at a tire factory for 12 years. Robert listened intently. "That day, the machine malfunctioned. I went to call my supervisor, but no one was around. So, I tried to shut it down myself, but suddenly, it started up again." The man lifted his trembling hands. His left arm looked thin, weak, and frail. Robert noticed the calluses, the deep scars. These were the hands of a man who had once worked tirelessly, but now they seemed worn from carrying the weight of life itself. "My arm got caught. I screamed, but no one came. I endured that hell for 5 whole minutes. My flesh was crushed between the machine's gears, my muscles torn apart. I could actually hear my bones cracking." Robert's jaw tightened, his fists clenching involuntarily. Finally, another worker heard me and shut the machine down. But by then, it was too late. I knew I'd never be the same again. The man lifted his head and met Robert's gaze. His eyes were glassy with unshed tears, yet he didn't cry. It was as if he had run out of them. "I went to the hospital. The doctor told me my arm would never regain its full strength. But the real shock came when I returned to work." The man let out a bitter laugh, but his voice trembled. "They called me into the office. The manager didn't even say, 'Get well soon.' The factory blamed the accident on me. 'It was your carelessness,' they said. No compensation, no severance. They just fired me on the spot. 12 years of work, gone. I was thrown out like garbage." Robert gritted his teeth in anger. "But that wasn't the worst part," the man continued. "At first, I thought things would get better. Maybe I'd find another job. Maybe I'd get some insurance help. But nothing happened. Every door was slammed in my face." Robert remained silent, letting him speak. "At home, my wife started looking at me differently. She used to love me, but after I lost my job, she saw me as a burden. 'What good are you now?' she said. 'How will you put food on the table with that useless arm?' Every day, I felt smaller. Every day, I was crushed a little more. She wasn't my wife anymore. She was a stranger." The man swallowed hard. "One day, I went out to look for work, and when I came back, the house was empty. She was gone. She had packed her bags and left. All she left behind was a note. 'Get a life, because I don't want to live with you anymore.'" Robert's expression hardened. "She abandoned me. But when she left, things only got worse. I couldn't pay the rent alone. My landlord knocked on my door. 'If you can't pay, get out,' he said. I got on my knees. I begged him for more time, but he wouldn't give me a chance." Robert turned his head slightly. How could people be this cruel? The man took a deep breath, exhaling heavily, before continuing. "And then, I ended up on the streets. I thought losing my job was the worst thing that could happen. Then I thought losing my wife was the worst thing. Then my home. But nothing was worse than life on the streets." Robert's voice was low. "What happened?" The man looked away, shaking his head. "People don't see you as human anymore. Think about it. I was a factory worker just a day before, and the next, no one would even look me in the eye. It was like I never existed. People wrinkled their noses as they passed me, muttering, 'Disgusting.'" The man swallowed hard. "One day, I was starving. I walked into a restaurant with a few coins in my hand. I told the cashier, "Just a bowl of soup, please, nothing more." She looked me up and down, and then she pressed a button under the counter. Security came. They threw me out like I was a thief. I didn't even get the soup. Robert's eyes narrowed in quiet fury. But that wasn't the worst. The man fell silent for a moment, as if reliving it all over again. One night, I was sleeping in a park. I had a thin, tattered blanket over me. My eyes had just closed when I felt someone pulling it away. I looked up. There was a group of teenagers laughing at me. Robert slowly nodded, and then the man clenched his fists. They beat me, with kicks, with punches. "If you won't work, you don't deserve to live," they said. They hit my face over and over again. I can still taste it, the blood, the hunger, the hopelessness. He took a shuddering breath, averting his gaze. That night, I crawled under a bench. My face was covered in blood. No one helped me. The next morning, a man walked by, looked at me and said, "It's people like you that make this city unlivable." Then he spat on me. Robert turned his face slightly, trying to suppress the burning rage inside him. This man had worked tirelessly for years. He had served his country, his family, and now people treated him like a disease. Robert clenched his fists and locked eyes with the man. "This won't end like this," he said firmly. "I'm going to make this right." The man looked at him, and for the first time in a long while, there was something in his eyes. Hope. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. Robert took a deep breath and pulled out his phone. "I'm not letting this go," he said, dialing his lawyer. "Do we have a new client?" his lawyer asked. "No, but we have someone who needs to see justice served." The man stared at Robert in disbelief. "Really? You would do this for me?" Robert nodded. "Not just for you, for everyone who's been wronged like you." After ending the call, Robert paused for a moment. Right now, the man didn't just need justice. He needed warmth, shelter, and a sliver of hope. "Would you like to stay with me for a few days?" he asked. The man blinked in surprise. I don't want to be a burden." Robert smiled. "Watching you sleep on the streets isn't an option. This isn't charity. It's the right thing to do." The man's eyes welled up. For the first time in years, someone truly wanted to help him. "Okay," he whispered. That night, for the first time in what felt like forever, the man slept in a warm bed. The next morning, Robert's lawyer called back with promising news. "This factory already has a history of violating workers' rights. If we push hard enough, we can get him compensation." The man's eyes widened in disbelief. "You mean I might actually get what I'm owed?" The lawyer nodded. "If you're ready to fight for it, yes." Robert leaned forward at the table. "Are you ready to fight?" The man hesitated for just a moment. Then, for the first time in a long while, there was a fire in his eyes. "Yes, I'll fight." The lawsuit was filed. 1 week later, the factory failed to prove that the accident was the workers' fault. In the end, they had no choice but to pay him compensation. But Robert wasn't done yet. When the case was settled, the man held the check in his hands, his eyes filled with tears. This is the first step to getting my life back." Robert smiled. "You don't just need money, you need a new future." The man looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" Robert slid a paper across the table. "I found you a job." The man raised his eyebrows. "What kind of job?" Robert grinned. "A job suited to your abilities. A car service center needs a consultant. Someone with your experience is exactly what they're looking for." The man closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. This time, he was crying out of happiness. "I never thought I deserved this." Robert placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You didn't get lucky. You just took back what was already yours." And that day, a man who had lost everything got a second chance at life.